villagers could hardly believe what they had witnessed. A woman, thought to be dead, had risen before their very eyes. Not only risen, but soared into the rafters of the church, as though gravity itself had surrendered. Her name was Christina of Brustum, and from that moment on, she would no longer be remembered as an ordinary shepherdess, but as something far more mysterious, Christina the Astonishing. But who was this young woman before the miracle that defined her life? And what did she see in the mysterious silence between life and death that compelled her to return to a world of suffering? To answer those questions, we must return to 12th century Europe and to the hidden life of a girl destined to astonish the world. The name Christina the Astonishing sounds almost like a title for a medieval legend, a figure born of myth. Yet she was real. She walked the fields of Belgium, tended sheep, and lived as a poor orphan with nothing but her hands to work and her heart to pray. Christina was born around the year 1150 in the village of Brustum, near the city of Liege. The world she entered was hard, marked by poverty, war, and a church that stood at the center of every community. Faith was not an accessory in this age. It was survival itself. People feared plague, hunger, and sudden death. They prayed for rain, for harvest, for mercy. And they believed, with utter seriousness, that life after death was real, that heaven, hell, and purgatory were not just ideas, but destinations as certain as sunrise. Christina grew up in this atmosphere of urgency and devotion. She was the daughter of poor parents who left her orphaned while she was still young. With no inheritance, no power, and no family to protect her, she lived as many poor girls did. A shepherdess wandering the fields, enduring the cold winds and the burning sun, caring for the flocks of others. But those who remembered her spoke of something unusual about Christina. She was not like the other young women of her village. While others laughed, gossiped, and chased the small pleasures of life, Christina often withdrew. She carried a quiet intensity, a seriousness of spirit that seemed too heavy for her age. She prayed often, sometimes disappearing into solitude, as though already listening for a voice that called her beyond this world. To us, her story may sound strange. But in the 12th century, visions and miracles were not dismissed as fantasy. People lived with a constant sense that the invisible world pressed against their daily lives. Bells rang out not only for prayer, but as weapons against storms and demons. Every Mass was a reminder that heaven came down to earth on the altar, and every funeral was a moment when eternity felt dangerously near. It was in this world that Christina lived and breathed. And yet, even in such an age, what would happen to her was beyond imagination. Christina's life took its first extraordinary turn in her early 20s. After years of toil in the fields, she suddenly fell gravely ill. The sickness spread quickly, and before long, her neighbors believed she had died. Word spread through Brustum that the young orphan girl, barely 21 years old, had passed from this life. The villagers did what they had done countless times before. They prepared her body, placed it in a coffin, and carried her to the church. Her funeral mass was celebrated with solemn chants and prayers for her soul. They believed she had joined the long line of the dead, awaiting judgment in the world to come. And then came the moment that no one would forget. Just as the priest's voice echoed through the final prayers of the Mass, Christina's body stirred. Gasps filled the air. Then, before the stunned eyes of her neighbors, she sat upright, opened her eyes, and breathed again. But this was not an ordinary return to life. Christina rose not with the weakness of one revived from illness, but with a shocking strength. She leapt upward, soaring into the rafters of the church, as though lifted by unseen hands. Clinging to the beams high above, she refused to come down. The congregation screamed. Some fled in terror, convinced they were seeing a ghost. Others fell to their knees, trembling in awe. Priests tried to coax her down, but she would not move. Her face was radiant, her eyes burning with something they could not understand. When at last she spoke, her words sent shivers through every heart present. She said she had been to the realms beyond this life. She had seen heaven, where the blessed rejoiced in the glory of God. She had seen hell, where the damned were tormented without end. And she had seen purgatory, where countless souls cried out for relief. And most astonishing of all, she had been given a choice: remain in the bliss of heaven, or return to earth to suffer for the sake of others. Out of love for God and compassion for the souls in purgatory, Christina had chosen the harder path. She had returned to endure suffering so that others might find release. From that moment, Christina's life was no longer her own. She was no longer just a shepherdess, no longer just a poor orphan. She became a living mystery, a woman between worlds, feared by some, revered by others. Her astonishing resurrection at her funeral was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. For the rest of her days, Christina would live a life so strange, so painful, and so beyond human explanation that people would either call her insane or recognize her as a sign of God's power. Christina the Astonishing had been born again into a mission: to suffer for the sake of souls. And nothing in her life would ever be ordinary again. When Christina's body collapsed in her early 20s, those around her thought her life had ended. But in truth, her story had only just begun. For in the mysterious silence of death, she found herself drawn beyond the veil of this world, into realms no living soul was meant to see. Christina would later explain that at the moment her body gave out, her soul was lifted from the earth. She looked down and saw her body lying lifeless. The sounds of weeping faded into silence. Time itself seemed to dissolve, and she was carried into a brightness that no words could capture. The first place she was shown was not terror, but peace, the radiant vision of heaven. Christina described heaven as a place of indescribable light, filled with the presence of God and the joy of the saints. Every soul she saw was wrapped in a glory so pure that it pierced her with longing. The music, the colors, the warmth, all of it surpassed anything she had ever known on earth. Here, she understood what Scripture had promised. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, nor has it entered the heart of man, what God has prepared for those who love Him. For a brief moment, Christina felt the bliss of eternal rest. The poverty and hardship of her earthly life seemed like dust compared to the beauty now before her, but this was not to last. Her journey was not yet complete. From the heights of heaven, she was taken downward far, far downward into the darkness of hell. What she saw there horrified her. Souls writhing in torment, chained by the sins they had chosen and never repented. The air was thick with despair, the sound a chorus of endless suffering. She saw pride twisted into rage, lust burning into fire, greed collapsing into emptiness. This was not punishment imposed from outside. Each soul seemed trapped within the very sins they had embraced in life, now consuming them eternally. Christina trembled. If heaven was beyond joy, hell was beyond terror, and she understood with chilling clarity. This was final. No one left this place. Her journey then took her to a third place, one less spoken of in her day, yet deeply feared and hoped for: Purgatory. Here, she witnessed multitudes of souls, countless beyond number. They cried out in suffering, but unlike hell, their cries carried a different note: hope. These were souls destined for heaven, but not yet purified. Their sins had been forgiven, but the wounds of those sins still clung to them like chains of fire. She saw flames, not of eternal punishment, but of cleansing. She saw souls begging for prayers, longing for relief, stretching out their hands to the living who might intercede for them. The suffering was real, yet so was the certainty of eventual joy. Still, the cries of anguish pierced Christina's heart. She realized that many of these souls had no one left on earth to pray for them, no loved ones to remember them, no priests to offer masses for their release. They suffered in silence, forgotten. It was then that Christina experienced the most extraordinary moment of her journey. She stood before the Lord and was offered a choice. She could remain in the bliss of heaven, sharing in the eternal joy she had already tasted. Or she could return to the world of the living, not to comfort, not to ease, but to a life of suffering and penance, chosen freely to help souls in purgatory find release. The choice should have been obvious. Who would give up paradise for a life of pain? Yet Christina's heart burned with a love greater than her own. She could not turn away from the countless souls who cried for help. She could not ignore their suffering. And so, with courage that astonished even heaven, Christina chose to return. She would embrace a life of agony, ridicule, and strangeness, not for herself, but for others. It was at that very moment that Christina's body stirred in her coffin, in the little church of Brustum. What the villagers saw as shocking resurrection was in truth the outward sign of her inward choice. She had died, but she had chosen to live again. Not as before, but as a living witness to what lies beyond death. No wonder she fled to the rafters of the church. For after tasting eternity, the stench of sin on earth was unbearable. She clung to the beams not in madness, but because the purity of heaven still burned within her, making the world below feel suffocating. When at last she spoke, her words confirmed the unthinkable. She had seen heaven, hell, and purgatory, and she had returned, not for her sake, but for the sake of countless souls. From that day on, Christina would be forever marked. She had become a woman between worlds. She no longer belonged fully to earth, nor fully to heaven. She was a bridge, a living reminder of what awaited every soul, and her life from then forward would be unlike anything the villagers or the world had ever seen. Christina's resurrection was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something that would defy every expectation. From the day she returned, she lived as though bound by no law of nature. She behaved in ways that left her neighbors shocked, frightened, or amazed. It was not simply that she prayed more or fasted longer or gave her life to charity. She lived as if she were no longer entirely human, as if the fire of eternity burned through her flesh. One of the strangest things about Christina was her reaction to sin. She claimed that after her vision, she could smell the stench of sin as clearly as others smelled smoke or rot. When someone approached her whose soul was burdened with vice, she would shudder, gag, and even flee in terror. Villagers reported seeing her leap into trees, scramble onto rooftops, or throw herself into the rafters of barns just to escape the odor of impurity. To those watching, it looked like madness. But to Christina, it was unbearable sensitivity to the corruption of the soul. Imagine the sight: a young woman, wild-eyed, clinging to a branch high above the ground, refusing to come down until the stench had passed. Some mocked her, others pitied her, but many stood in awe. Christina's penances were even more disturbing. She seemed determined to throw herself into suffering. She hurled her body into ovens blazing with fire, staying inside until the flames died down and emerged unburned. She plunged into freezing rivers, letting the current drag her away until villagers thought she had drowned, only to reappear days later, alive and unharmed. More than once, she allowed mill wheels to drag her underwater, her body crushed and battered. Yet she returned to shore breathing, as if the laws of life and death had no claim on her. Why would she do such things? Christina explained it simply. She chose these sufferings as penance for the souls in purgatory. She would endure in her body what they endured in spirit, offering her pain to shorten their torment. Reactions to Christina were mixed. Some villagers whispered that she was insane, possessed by demons, or cursed. Parents warned their children not to go near her. There were times she was seized, chained, or locked away, simply because people feared her. And yet, others were convinced she was holy. Word spread across Belgium and beyond about the strange woman who had risen from the dead, who could not be harmed by fire or water, who lived in poverty but shone with otherworldly strength. Pilgrims began to seek her out. Priests cautiously observed her. Even learned theologians would come to write about her, unwilling to dismiss her as a mere madwoman. To the common people, she was both terrifying and fascinating. They could not explain her, and perhaps that was the point. Christina herself asked for nothing. She lived without possessions, wore rags instead of fine clothing, and begged for scraps of food. Often she fasted until her body seemed impossibly thin, yet her energy burned as if fueled by something unseen. She slept wherever she could, in barns, in trees, or on bare ground. She never sought comfort, never pursued safety. To her, the world was not home but exile. The only thing that mattered was to embrace suffering for the sake of others. But Christina was not a cold figure, lost in madness. Beneath her strange actions burned a love deeper than most could understand. She did not suffer for the thrill of it. She suffered for others. Every fire she entered, every freezing current she endured, every leap into the air was an act of mercy. She saw herself as a bridge between the living and the dead, a living sacrifice, so that others might find freedom. And though her actions shocked and terrified those around her, they revealed a love willing to pay any price. Observers often said Christina seemed to exist halfway between this world and the next. She lived among people, but she did not live like them. She walked barefoot through the streets, yet her eyes seemed to look beyond what was visible. She laughed sometimes with a joy that startled those nearby, as though she were listening to music they could not hear. At other times, she screamed in terror, as though surrounded by invisible torments. This was the paradox of her life. Joy and agony, laughter and suffering, all mingled together. She carried the marks of eternity in her body, and the world around her could hardly comprehend it. The more her story spread, the more people wrestled with the same question. Was she insane? Or was she a living miracle? Was her suffering self-inflicted madness or chosen holiness? For the villagers who saw her leap into fires and emerge unharmed, or who dragged her limp body from icy waters, only to watch her awaken hours later, the answer was not so simple. She was a mystery that demanded explanation, and perhaps that was her purpose. By her very existence, Christina forced people to confront realities they preferred to ignore. The weight of sin, the reality of death, the suffering of souls in purgatory. Her life, however strange, was a sermon no one could forget. For decades, Christina lived this way, neither fully accepted nor fully rejected, wandering from place to place, bearing in her body the suffering she had chosen. She lived through mockery, through chains, through isolation. And yet she endured, because her mission was not yet complete. The shepherdess of Brustum had become a prophet without words, a woman whose very life was a message. That the unseen world is more real than the visible, and that love is proved in sacrifice. And though many called her insane, the church would one day remember her by another name, Christina the Astonishing. For decades after her astonishing resurrection, Christina lived a life that blurred the line between earth and eternity. To many, she appeared mad, hurling herself into rivers, climbing rooftops to escape the smell of sin, enduring fires that should have consumed her. But beneath her strange behavior, those who listened closely discovered something far deeper. A woman who spoke with wisdom, and who carried in her heart a love that burned hotter than any flame. When Christina spoke, her words often startled those around her. She spoke with piercing insight, warning sinners to repent and urging the faithful to pray for souls forgotten in purgatory. Her voice, though sometimes trembling from exhaustion, carried a weight that silenced her listeners. She had no education, no books, no teachers, and yet her understanding of the mysteries of God ran deeper than the cleverest scholar. Thomas of Cantimpré, the Dominican theologian who recorded her life, wrote that he himself was struck by the authority of her words. Though he was a learned man, her testimony left him humbled. Christina seemed to see the invisible wounds of others. She could describe hidden sins, sometimes speaking directly to those who thought no one knew their secrets. She could comfort the grieving with words that touched the heart. And always she returned to the same plea: pray for the souls who suffer unseen. But her gift came with a heavy burden. Christina's life was marked by almost constant pain. She accepted hunger, cold, and exhaustion as normal companions. She was beaten, mocked, even chained at times by those who thought her possessed. Yet she never rebelled, never fought back. Instead, she embraced her suffering as if it were a crown. She once explained that her body was only a vessel, a tool by which she could share in the suffering of souls. Every wound she bore, every hardship she accepted, was transformed into prayer for others. This is what made her suffering astonishing. She did not endure pain out of despair. She embraced it out of love. Over time, the villagers who once feared her began to see her differently. Though her actions remained strange, they could not ignore her endurance. She lived without comfort, without protection, yet she never ceased to pray, never ceased to suffer for others. Pilgrims began to visit Brustum to see her. Some came in curiosity, others in faith. Stories spread of her wisdom, of her supernatural survival, of her courage. Those who approached her often left changed, struck by the seriousness with which she spoke of eternity. Even priests and monks, cautious at first, began to acknowledge her holiness. While some still whispered that she was mad, others believed she had been chosen by God for a mission that went beyond understanding. Christina lived for decades after her first death, enduring her astonishing life until her final years. By the time she reached her 70s, an age few women in her time ever saw, her body was worn thin from suffering, yet her spirit remained aflame. In her last days, she found refuge in the convent of Saint Catherine at St. Truiden. Here, surrounded by women of prayer, she prepared for the moment when she would finally be allowed to rest. Unlike her first death, her final passing came peacefully. On July 24, 1224, Christina the Astonishing died once more, this time without returning. Witnesses said her face shone with serenity, as though the suffering of decades had at last given way to the joy she had once tasted in heaven. Christina's memory did not fade with her burial. Almost immediately, devotion to her began to spread. The people of St. Truiden and Brustum remembered her not as a madwoman, but as a saint who had lived among them. Stories of her penances, her miracles, and her visions were told and retold. For centuries, pilgrims visited her tomb, praying for her intercession. Though she was never formally canonized by the Pope, her cult was confirmed by Pope Pius Roman IX in the 19th century. To this day, she is honored as Saint Christina the Astonishing, and her feast is celebrated each year on July 24th. What does her legacy mean? Christina's life was not easy to understand, even for those closest to her. But perhaps that is the point. She stands as a reminder that holiness does not always look like what we expect. Saints are not always gentle, tidy, or respectable. Sometimes they are fierce, wild, even unsettling. Christina's mission was not to comfort the comfortable. It was to shake people awake, to remind them of realities they had forgotten, to suffer on behalf of those who could no longer pray for themselves. And though her actions seemed astonishing, even bizarre, they were all driven by love for God, love for the lost, love for souls trapped in suffering. When we look back on her life, we see a woman who lived as a contradiction, poor yet rich in spirit, mocked yet revered, insane in the eyes of many yet remembered by the Church as holy. She was, truly, Christina the Astonishing. A woman who rose from death, who walked between worlds, who bore suffering for the sake of others. And in her life, as strange and unsettling as it was, we find a testimony that still speaks. That eternity is real, that sin is weighty, and that love is worth every sacrifice. Centuries have passed since Christina the Astonishing walked the fields of Belgium. Her story may feel distant, wrapped in the strangeness of the medieval world. And yet, when we pause to reflect, her life speaks with surprising force to us today. We live in an age where suffering is avoided at all costs. We seek comfort, convenience, and safety. Pain is treated as meaningless, something to escape or hide. But Christina's life turns this thinking upside down. She shows us that suffering, when embraced in love, can become powerful. It can become a gift for others, a bridge between earth and eternity. Her actions shocked her neighbors, and they still shock us. Who would willingly leap into fire or plunge into icy waters? Who would choose hunger, ridicule, and exhaustion when an easier path was possible? To the world, it looked like madness. But to Christina, it was love. She carried within her the cries of forgotten souls, and she chose to suffer so that they might find peace. Her life also reminds us of something our modern world often forgets: the reality of the unseen. Heaven, hell, purgatory, these are not just old words from dusty books. To Christina, they were as real as the ground beneath her feet. She lived every day with eternity burning in her heart. And because of that, she could not live an ordinary life. What does that mean for us? Perhaps we are not called to leap into fire or climb rooftops to escape sin. But we are called to remember that our lives reach beyond what we can see. Every choice matters. Every prayer counts. And every act of love, no matter how small, echoes in eternity. Christina's life may be astonishing, even unsettling. But it challenges us to ask, what do we live for? Do we live only for comfort, or do we live for something greater? Do we see suffering as empty, or do we see it as a chance to love? In the end, Christina the Astonishing is not just a saint of the past. She is a mirror held up to every generation, daring us to confront the truth we would rather avoid. That life is brief, death is certain, and eternity is real. And perhaps that is why her story endures. Not because she was strange, not because she was misunderstood, but because in her astonishing life, she points us to the astonishing love of God, a love strong enough to suffer, strong enough to save, and strong enough to turn even the strangest life into a beacon of hope.